Morning, everyone. So I think we've had a good discussion so far about what ZEV is and maybe some of the background, the case for ZEV. As Alan mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit more now about how the market is reacting to these various issues. And when I think about the automotive market today, probably the single most compelling thing that pops up really is this whole issue of technology. Technology is this pervasive thing that is really changing how we interface with devices all across the spectrum. So cell phones would be a good example. I'm old enough to remember when cell phones were first introduced. I think it was back in 1984 in LA for the Olympics, if you remember the LA Olympics. And you look at them today and they're just completely different machines in terms of the capabilities that they support. Think about automobiles and how technology is really changing automobiles on a whole myriad of fronts. Obviously connectivity, which is kind of a double-edged sword. Consumers love to feel connected when they're in vehicles, but there's certainly safety implications to that. Speaking of safety, there's a revolution facing us in a very positive way in terms of safety technologies that are rolling out in vehicles. We're shifting perhaps a little bit, we need to shift a little bit more quickly in terms of our thinking, but we're shifting from a real focus on technologies that allow you to survive an accident, really passive safety technologies, to a focus that I think is going to be much more productive, and that is how do you avoid accidents in the first place? Because the best way to survive an accident is just not to have one. So there's a blizzard of very exciting active safety technologies that are just coming into the marketplace, and I think they're going to transform how we view transportation safety. But also technology has been profoundly influencing powertrains. So we've talked a little bit about those powertrains today. But it also is impacting just the traditional, well, I can't even really say traditional because the internal combustion engine today is pretty much anything but traditional. Think about some of the advanced components, direct injection, variable rate valve type, timing, modern superchargers, all sorts of things that are allowing the internal combustion engine, I think, to be surprisingly efficient in terms of not just power, but also in terms of fuel savings, and then also in terms of being better from an emissions standpoint. But having said that, when you take a look at what we're talking about today, and I'm going to beg an indulgence here because when I think about advanced powertrains from the consumer perspective, consumers get very confused about all this stuff. So folks here are really close to it and something of experts, but when you start talking to consumers about plug-ins and hybrids and EVs, they don't really get the difference. To them, they're just advanced powertrain vehicles. In most cases, I realize there's some folks that are really excited about electric vehicles, and that's all they think about, but that's certainly not the mainstream. So despite all these new technologies coming out and a lot of the excitement around them, when you step back and look at what's happening in the marketplace, the market share for advanced technology, advanced powertrain vehicles tends to hover somewhere between 2 to 3%. Right now it's up around 3.4%. Basically 95, 96, 97% of all the vehicles sold in the United States are being powered by much more traditional powertrains, recognizing they've got advanced technologies associated with them, but they're still internal combustion engine powertrains. And you can see that another way as well. Just look at the best-selling vehicles, and when you read a lot of the headlines, you might get the impression that the best-selling vehicles in America might be hybrids, but actually that's not the case at all. In fact, the best-selling vehicle in America is actually a good old-fashioned pickup truck, and it kind of stays that way pretty much month in and month out. I'm calling these APVs. I know that's another acronym to throw out there. These are just advanced powertrain vehicles. So they have been growing in terms of their market share. And I think one of the assumptions might be, and this is something that we should talk about, the assumption might be that as more and more of these types of vehicles are being introduced in the marketplace, does that mean that their market share is going to climb? And I'm going to push back on that a little bit because I'm not sure if the evidence is clear that that's going to be the case. I do think that one thing that is clear is that the sale of these vehicles is very highly tied to fuel prices. And we seem to have gotten into this pattern over the last few years where there's a sort of a seasonality of fuel prices. This year is a bit of an exception, but you see very strong correlations between the interest in advanced powertrain vehicles and frankly smaller vehicles too, better fuel efficiency vehicles of all types that really jumps up when fuel prices climb and then it drops off again when fuel prices tend to drop back down. The other thing you see is that you need a bigger bump in fuel prices to get the same sort of impact in terms of the consumer attention. So we all get desensitized to fuel prices over time. I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's certainly a reality. There is something else that's really interesting about this. So number one, APVs are a sliver of the marketplace. Number two, very strongly tied to fuel prices. But the thing that's really remarkable is that the segment that I'm describing here is really dominated by a single brand. And again, I think it's interesting to sort of hypothesize, hey, as more and more of these vehicles get out there, does that mean that the Prius market share, in terms of the share of that segment, is that going to drop or is it going to continue to dominate? And my sense is that the Prius is occupying in the consumer mind a unique place. And I'm going to give you an example of what I'm talking about here. I recognize that not everybody is the same, so I can't really say this is the case for every consumer, but I think for a lot of consumers, this is what's happening. And it really goes back to buying motivations. I'm going to talk about why people are buying various vehicles in just a second, but let's focus on the Prius. If you think about what motivates people, most people are buying vehicles for a whole myriad of attributes that they're looking for, but there are a small subset of buyers who are looking to make a statement. So an example of this would be like the Volkswagen Bug in the 60s and 70s, which was kind of a counterculture statement. 70s, you know, Cadillac was kind of a statement, you've arrived, and Mercedes kind of picked up the mantle from that. But there are people that are buying vehicles not so much because of the specific attributes associated with that vehicle, but because of the statement that vehicle makes about them as a buyer. And the thing about statements is they have to be understood. So if I want to make a statement about the fact that I am sensitive about the environment, or I care about emissions, or I care about energy security, or whatever the statement might be, the Prius has sort of become established as that common language that both buyers and society can kind of recognize. And you don't need a lot of vehicles that actually can make that statement. You really only need one, because it doesn't really matter. It's not that much about the vehicle, it's a lot more about the statement. So I think in the marketplace, the Prius has sort of established itself as that statement vehicle. And it's not clear to me that as more and more vehicles are being offered into that segment, that the segment really needs another vehicle to make that statement. And one could easily see a situation where the remaining buyers in that segment are just being sliced up into more and more slices as there's more and more offerings out there. I don't think it's going to be quite that clear cut. I do think the segment's going to grow, but I think we need to be pretty measured in what our expectations are as we think about future growth. Talked a little bit about what's motivating people. So there's a lot of surveys out there that talk about the importance of fuel efficiency. You call up people at dinner and you say, what are you really looking for in the next car you're going to buy? And the survey results invariably come back with, I want a car with better fuel efficiency. And I think that gets misunderstood on a couple levels. One is I think there's a lot of survey bias when you're actually doing surveys that way. There's a bias called socially acceptable response bias, where people basically are telling you what they think that they should be saying, and fuel efficiency is one of those things that's very politically correct right now, so people are always talking about fuel efficiency. What we've actually done is quite a bit deeper. So as Alan mentioned, we track sales all across the country. We've been doing over the last few years now a study to actually correlate all industry sales, so this is not a sample, this is a census study, and looking at what attributes are associated with those vehicles. In other words, what is it that's driving people to buy vehicles in today's marketplace? So the importance of this, it's not a survey. We're not asking people to tell us what they're going to do next time they buy a vehicle. We're actually watching what it is that people do. We use this for a website, to power a lot of tools on the website, but it also gives us great insights in terms of what's motivating consumers. And you can break this out by segment. You can slice and dice it a bunch of different ways. The data I've got here is actually for all the vehicles in the marketplace. And you'll see that MPG is an important factor for a little less than, it's about 10% of the vehicle decision weighting. Not that high. Things like the brand and luxury, and these are kind of roll-ups of vehicle attributes. Again, you can kind of slice and dice this a bunch of different ways. But I think the fundamental point here is that for the majority of car buyers, the reason that they are buying the vehicle is much more complex than simple things like fuel efficiency. And in fact, for most consumers, fuel efficiency is more of a cost than an attribute. It's kind of like saying, next time you're buying a vehicle, you want to get better fuel efficiency. Well, next time I'm buying a vehicle, I want to get a lower price, or I'd like to get a bigger rebate. I mean, who wouldn't? But that's not the reason that you're buying that vehicle. You're buying it because you need to take 3 kids to soccer practice, or you've got a boat that you want to tow, or whatever it might be. So I think it's important to kind of unpack this issue and really understand what's motivating people. And I think Costa kind of alluded to this a little bit. I'm going to talk about it as well, that what people are looking for is actually a very complex amalgam. They actually want just about everything. They want better vehicles. And when you look at it, what's amazing is that car companies are actually delivering this. Think about the Camry. You know, Toyota's obviously gracious enough to host us here. The old Camry and the new Camry is better in every way. You think about the Honda Accord, it delivers. more safety, better connectivity, better fuel efficiency, better performance. It's all the way around a better vehicle. Those are the kinds of vehicles that are doing really well in the marketplace. If you ask people to give something up that they really value in exchange for better fuel efficiency, it's not going to energize most consumers. They're just not going to respond. The other thing that I think is fascinating is that I've seen a lot of math done on this. And you could argue that an advanced powertrain vehicle has maybe a 3 or 4 year payoff in terms of fuel savings. And, you're paying maybe an extra $5,000 or $6,000, maybe $10,000 to get this vehicle, but that's paid back over the life cycle of the vehicle. Whatever the math is, it varies depending on the vehicle. The fascinating thing about the data that we're looking at is that consumers will accept a premium, but they want a 12-month or less payback, which is, it doesn't make any sense. But a lot of things about consumers don't necessarily make sense. You look at this from a rational economic perspective and you'd think, well, they're going to own the vehicle for 4 years. You'd think they would be happy with a 4-year payoff. Not the case. They're looking for a 12-month or less payback. So that raises kind of the obvious question, and I'm sure we'll get into this in part of the Q&A and part of the discussion. But if, from a car company perspective, the difficulty that they have to be wrestling with is how do they bridge the gap between sort of this market apathy and mandates that are coming from the various levels of government. And it's easy to say, well, the car companies will figure it out. But I'm always reminded, and I feel kind of old and creaky when I mention this because I actually remember some of these things. But back in the 70s, we had a blizzard of regulation to hit the marketplace, safety, emissions, all sorts of things that the car companies were wrestling with. And the result was almost a generation of really bad vehicles. And I just was mentioning how consumers want better vehicles. You go back and you think about some of the cars coming out of the car companies in the late 70s, even in the early 80s. This was like the dark age of automotive design, really bad vehicles. And a lot of the reputational damage, particularly with the Detroit car companies, that they're still struggling with, was born in that era. So sometimes car companies, they'll figure out how to meet the mandates, but the way they do it may not be in a way that actually is responsive to what consumers are demanding in the marketplace, and the impact of that can be quite severe.